important. So there's a great interview that you can still find online from 1985 that Steve Jobs did with Playboy magazine. And in this interview, he's talking about the importance of the details, the little things. And Steve Jobs says, when you're a carpenter making a beautiful chest of drawers, you're not going to use a piece of plywood on the back, even though it faces the wall and nobody will ever see it. You'll know it's there. So you're going to use a beautiful piece of wood on that back. For you to sleep well at night, the aesthetic, the quality has to be carried all the way through. So I think this is a good example where Steve Jobs really did, care about the small details. And that's something he learned early on, he said, from his father, and he tried to use it in his work. So that is the theme. Little things do matter. Of course, the big things matter the most, but we got to get those little things as well. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. And that has to do with aspect ratios and slides. So basically, we're 4:3 or 16:9. 4:3 is still good, especially for cinema and some video. For presentations, maybe occasionally, if it's intentional. But for the most part, we have 16:9 screens, and we want to present 16:9 slides in that space. But you often see this 4:3 slides, even if they're well designed, it just doesn't look that hot on a 16:9 screen. But more than just aesthetics, it might suggest that, it's sort of like misspelling in a resume or on a slide. It's not the end of the world, but it suggests that, does this person really know all that they're talking about? It's not as professional as it could be. So you see this, everywhere. I see it all the time. Really smart people who really know what they're talking about, but 4:3 slides on a 16:9 screen, that's not what they're designed for. Expected, I guess, from politicians. This is over 10 years ago or so. 4:3 on a 16:9 TV. Again, something like this all over the place. We see it. So in PowerPoint, of course, you can select your aspect ratio. There's defaults there. 4:3, 16:9, and you can customize it as well. And in Keynote as well, it's the same thing, 16:9, 4:3, measured in pixels. So it's a lot easier to kind of customize it here because you might be presenting, you might be at a conference or someplace that has very, very wide screen, and they might ask you, they might give you a different aspect ratio. You can design slides in PowerPoint or Keynote that are very wide, just like this one here. So as I said before, this is the future. We're going to be using wider and wider screens like this. And we're starting to see, or have for quite a while, we've seen projectors at 16:9, but still they're not always configured as well as they could be. So there's a lot of empty, not a good use of empty space, but just not made as large as they could, not filling the screen as large as they could. But anyway, there's basically 16:9 wherever you go, at least that. So this is a standard 16:9 slide. In some of the older conference halls or training centers or office buildings, they have built-in beautiful screens and stages like this, but the screens are still 4:3. I mean, Apple used to have 4:3 in their stores for a long time, and now they've switched to 16:9 if they're using a projection screen. And this is fine if you know that you can't change this. Personally, I don't mind at all designing 4:3 slides to fill this space rather than using 16:9 because that's going to fill that space. So this is 4:3. Or it's 4:3 because it's very similar to the original movies or older movies that had a very similar aspect ratio. So this became a standard. This was normal in cinema for a while. Then when TV became very popular, cinema became more interested in being very wide. So that was different than TV. But for most of my life, we watched TV like this at 4:3. And it's great, but it causes you to design in a little bit different way. For example, you can have a 2-shot or a 3-shot like this. It's more difficult or more challenging for landscapes, for having very, very wide shots. But it's great for close-ups like this. So that's 4:3, and that's what we used in PowerPoint or Keynote for a long, long time. And of course, these days, 16:9. And 16:9 is just sort of a compromise from the wider cinematic. So standard is 1.85:1, but a lot of movies are even wider than that. And some movies are even wider than that. So, a lot of people really love the wide cinematic format, which is actually my personal favorite too. I love them wide, but I like the old movies. I don't mind watching them in the original 4:3. So this is just an example. So today, a lot of people are presenting like this, like my friend Dr. Enfelt from Sweden, which is presenting in a way that's even wider than cinema. But of course, for most of us, we're lucky if we have a very nice, large 16:9 screen. And it's great if we do, even if it's a projector, we can design slides that are very cinematic, easy to see from anyone in the room, even if we're using lots of data or quantitative displays. The wide aspect ratio is really nice for presenting things like a world map, really fits nicely on 16 by 9 rather than 4 by 3. But if we use 4 by 3 on a 16 by 9 slide, as I said, it's not really a great look. But you might say, I mean, what does it matter? But if you were a photographer, for example, and you had beautiful black and white photos that you took, you wouldn't frame it in this way. You wouldn't put your photos in a frame that's not quite the right size, revealing the sort of background paper or the wood from the frame. That's not a real nice look, right? Even though you think, well, it's a small thing, it's a very important detail. We want to frame our photos correctly because it says something. It's not just aesthetics, it says something about us, that we care about our art, that we want to present it in the best way possible. So the frame matters, the little things matter. And you might think, well, this is awful, insignificant detail. But, if we were talking about cuisine, especially if you're spending a lot of money for a night out, you would say that it all matters. Of course, it's the taste of the food, it's the quality of the food, it's the nutritional value of the food. There's a million things that are very important. And you would never say that the presentation of the food or its visual is not important. Of course, that's important. That's a big part of it. Or the quality of the plate or the tablecloth. All of these things matter because they suggest professionalism, or, if you had it like a dirty tablecloth, let's say everything else was perfect, but the tablecloth was kind of cheap. Well, that suggests something. It says a lot about the quality of the experience that's coming ahead of us. So it's kind of like that with presentation too. We don't have to be perfect, but we should at least get some of the little details as much as we can. We should get those correct. And one of those things is making sure we have 16 by 9 slides for a 16 by 9 screen, where ever possible. So if you look at old Apple keynotes, of course, the slide completely filled the screen. In fact, we're not even aware of a screen. Just like when you see a really good movie, you go to a movie, a great theater, you never really see the screen, especially if you just arrive when the movie's starting. Then you're not even really aware of a screen because the movie goes right to the borders, so it fills that space. And of course, you would expect that. That's a very small detail, but it's very important. And if you didn't have that, if there was a little bit of screen showing, of course, Steve Jobs would never go for that because it's a small detail, but an important one. And this is Steve Jobs in the old days after he just came back. In those days, of course, we did use 4 by 3 slides and screens, but as you see, it completely fills the screen, as you would expect. So you do see this kind of thing a lot, and it's often not the fault of the presenter, but it could be the way the projector is configured or it was set up. But this should matter. So if you see a situation like this, if you're the presenter or you're organizing a conference, this should bother you. So if you're an organizer for a conference for professors or teachers or students or whoever coming in, you should try to make sure you can fill the screen and ask your presenters to design 16 by 9 slides if you're going to be using a 16 by 9 screen. So there are times when you could use a 4 by 3 aspect ratio. If you can't change the size of the screen or the aspect ratio of the screen, it's going to be 4 by 3 and you're stuck, you can't change it. Then you could there are little tricks you can do, like close the curtain if you have a lot of empty screen space on the sides, right? You can see how that makes a big difference. It's a small thing, but it's just it's more than just aesthetics. And aesthetics is also kind of a feeling and a suggestion of something beyond that. This reminds me of some spaces I've been in where the 4 by 3 screen is locked in, so you can't change that. You could put a 16 by 9 slide in there. It would just be white at the bottom and the top. It'd be empty space there. But still, that's not a great look. So we can fill the screen like this. And I still do this from time to time where there's screens that are locked. And so they've asked me, 4 by 3. And I go, yeah, that's fine. I don't mind doing that. There's an adjustment you have to make with your slides, of course, but it doesn't really take all that much time. And there's some advantages to 4 by 3 in some situations where the slide is really massive like this. So I think this is better than having the bottom and the top white. It would just be showing the screen. So also when you present online in meetings, people often present like this, or they have a 16 by 9 slide on their left or their right shoulder. You could do something like that, something like the TV news. But actually in this case, it might be better to use more of a square visual or a 4 by 3 visual. And if you look at, parody news stations or even real news stations, you'll see this a lot. So it's not a 16 by 9, it's closer to a square or a 4 by 3 aspect ratio. And that works really well. So that is a place I think where 4x3 is still fine. Now, as I said, it's not always the presenter's fault. Sometimes you just get to a space and you can't control it. And it's just the way the projector is configured or where it was placed. So it's not taking advantage of the space that it has. And yeah, so we say in Japan, shoganai, or c'est la vie. But we should try to change that. So if you're in charge of the conference or the meeting, you want to make sure that you fill the screen. So this is really common to see this kind of thing everywhere. So these are some examples recently. So I presented in Hirakata in this convention center, beautiful space, massive 16:9 screen projector, and yet you can still get in front of it. This one is just an example of where I went in at a big screen, wider than 16:9. So we closed the curtains to get it 16:9 on the sides, but still the projected image was still too small. So I have to ask them very politely and work with the tech people up in the booth to get them to make it larger. So for a lot of people, they just said, well, that was good enough, but it was really a small image compared to what we could get. So as you see in this picture, we're getting close. And I think we just about filled the screen so that you weren't really aware of the screen behind. And here is we were doing it at a different place, and we're just adjusting it. Close the curtains to the 16:9, and then we got the vertical right, and then also on the side. So we eventually got that correct. Or you might have a screen like this, a sort of a portable slide. Doesn't look great this way, but of course you can adjust it. So we could go like this, and then, yeah, that looks a lot better, doesn't it? Or something like this. So it might be where the top part is okay at 16:9. It looks fine on the top, but you have all this space down below you don't need, but you can just adjust that and then frame it properly like that. That looks a lot better. So again, this is a small thing, but I've heard from a lot of people, it's annoying, they say, to see a 4x3 slide, where today the standard is, of course, 16:9 or even wider in some cases. And in this case, it really makes a difference. We can go from this to this. It's a small thing, but it's those small things that can add up and make a difference. Thank you for listening to my rambling. I appreciate it. If you have any questions or any stories about 4x3 or 16:9 in terms of presentation or in terms of filmmaking or video, don't hesitate to share them in the comments. All right, I appreciate it. Thank you.